Good evening, everyone. It is indeed an evening in all its grandeur as we gather here today for yet another book unveiling event, Kitaab, in Delhi. I, Dipali Bhasin, Ehsaas Woman of Delhi, warmly welcome you to a magnificent book launch here at the India International Centre, New Delhi, organized by Prabha Khaitan Foundation. Amidst us today, we are privileged to have distinguished personalities from the field of literature, academics, and public affairs. We gather here tonight for an immensely riveting book launch of Gods, Guns, and Missionaries by Manu S. Pillai. The event will feature a panel discussion on the book between Dr. Tharoor, who's going to be arriving here shortly, and author Manu S. Pillai, moderated by Ms. Ira Mukhoty. I extend a warm welcome to our guests for today. May we have a huge round of applause for the dignitaries, please. Today's event couldn't have been possible without the unwavering support of Ehsaas Women of Delhi. I now invite Ms. Neelima Dalmia Adhar, Honorary Convenor of Delhi NCR Affairs, to say a few words about the foundation.
Thank you, Dipali. Good evening, friends. As Honorary Convenor of Delhi NCR Affairs of the Prabha Khaitan Foundation, it gives me immense pleasure and joy to be introducing the foundation to all of you. The Prabha Khaitan Foundation is a non-profitable trust committed to humanitarian and socio-cultural causes. The late Dr. Prabha Khaitan established this foundation as a charitable trust in the early 1980s. Based in Kolkata, it is committed to supporting women's empowerment, gender equality, literature, culture, and performing arts. The late Dr. Khaitan was an eminent Indian literature, philanthropist, social worker, entrepreneur, and feminist who established and believed in our national aphorism of unity in diversity. The Foundation's multifaceted initiatives include the Right Circle, Kalam, Akhar, Kitaab, an author's afternoon, Loves, Shabd, Ek Mulaqat, Tete, The Universe Writes, Chopal, Rahat, Karuna, Muskan, and other boutique festivals like Shehernama and Ramayan Kala Utsav. These fall under diverse verticals of literature and language, culture and heritage, social welfare, and women's empowerment. Of the literary initiatives, Kitaab occupies a unique significance for us by marking the emergence of new books and offering authors a stage to present their literary works to an insightful and discerning audience. The anthem of the foundation deserves special mention, which we are very proud of, inspired by our national philosophy, unity in diversity. It has been curated by the musical genius Pandit Vishwamohan Bhatt. The anthem reflects the true essence of the multicultural diversity of India. Over to you, Dipali.
Thank you, Ms. Neelima Dalmia Adhar. I deem it now my privilege to introduce the dignitaries for the day. I'm going to start with the star for the evening, Manu S. Pillai. Manu S. Pillai is a historian and the author of 5 books. Most recently, Gods, Guns, and Missionaries, The Making of the Modern Hindu Identity, 2024. A winner of the Sahitya Academy Yuva Puraskar, he holds a PhD in history from King's College London and has been writing in several national publications over the last 10 years. His other books are The Ivory Throne, 2015, Rebel Sultans, 2018, The Courtesan, The Mahatma, and the Italian Brahmin, 2019, and False Allies, 2021. Heartiest welcome to you, Mr. Manu S. Pillai. The moderator for today will be Ms. Ira Mukhoty. Ira Mukhoty is a best-selling writer of narrative history. She's the author of Akbar. Welcome, Dr. Tharoor. Ira Mukhoty is a best-selling writer of narrative history. She's the author of Akbar the Great Mughal, Song of Draupadi, a novel, Daughters of the Sun, Empresses, Queens and Begums of the Mughal Empire, and Heroines, Powerful Indian Women in Myth and History. Her latest book, The Lion and the Lily, examines the rise and fall of Awadh in the context of the global Franco-British Wars. In the course of her research, she traveled to Berlin, Chambéry, Paris, Wales, and London, and was able to access French language documents which have been presented for the first time in a work of narrative history. Ira has participated in a BBC Uzbek service documentary, In the Footsteps of Babur, which examined the role of prominent women in Babur's extended family. A heartfelt welcome to Ira Mukhoty. While his remarkable accomplishments truly need no introduction, allow me the honor of briefly highlighting Dr. Shashi Tharoor's exceptional contributions. Dr. Shashi Tharoor is a 4-term Member of Parliament, Lok Sabha, for Thiruvananthapuram and the Chairman of the Parliamentary Standing Committee on External Affairs. He is the best-selling author of 26 books, both fiction and non-fiction, besides being a former Under-Secretary General of the United Nations and a former Minister of State for Human Resource Development and for External Affairs in the Government of India. He has won numerous awards, including the Pravasi Bharatiya Samman, a Commonwealth Writers' Prize, and the Crossword Lifetime Achievement Award. In 2019, Dr. Tharoor was also awarded the Sahitya Academy Award in the category of English non-fiction for his book An Era of Darkness. He previously chaired the Parliament's Standing Committee on Chemicals and Fertilizers, as well as the Committee on Information Technology. A very warm welcome to you, Dr. Shashi Tharoor. I now invite and request the 3 distinguished guests to join us on stage and grace the occasion. We were waiting for you. I now invite the Ehsaas Women of Delhi, Ms. Neelima Dalmia Adhar and Ms. Karuna Goenka, to come on stage and felicitate the guests. Prabha Khaitan Foundation advocates promoting cross-state cultural appreciation with each culture that adds to the nation's unique character. Keeping this in mind, we are pleased to felicitate the author and guests with unique handloom stalls.
All I need is a white handkerchief for the Indian flag.
Now for the moment we have all been eagerly waiting for. The book launch of Gods, Guns and Missionaries, authored by Manu S. Pillai. To join us on stage, we have my fellow Ehsaas ladies and our 3 distinguished guests for the unveiling of the book. I now request the chief guest, Dr. Shashi Tharoor, to unveil the book.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
It is our distinct privilege to invite our chief guest for today, Dr. Shashi Tharoor, to the dais to enlighten us with a few words.
Thank you, everyone, and my sincere apologies for my late arrival. I was chairing the meeting of the Committee on External Affairs. It happened to be on the very compelling topic of Bangladesh. The Foreign Secretary has just come back from there and was briefing us, and inevitably ran well over time, which I should have anticipated before agreeing on this particular time slot. But I'm so glad that you haven't been kept waiting too long, and that you already had embarked upon the introductions and so on before I got here. I just want to say how very proud I am to yet again be releasing a book by Manu Pillai. This is his 5th book, and I've had a hand in unveiling all of them in Delhi, I think, only in Delhi. But nonetheless, I say this with an immense amount of pride and affection, because I've known Manu since he was 21. And as a precociously bright youngster, he wrote to me out of the blue. And I took him on initially thinking that he might be useful to have some English-knowing chap in my Trivandrum office, and within a very short while realized that he was the exceptional person I wanted right next to me in Delhi. And over the years, Manu did 2 separate stints in my office, and even came and rescued us once when one of his successors ended up in a rather nasty accident and couldn't come to work, and Manu came and bailed me out. So he's been very close to me, somebody I have an enormous amount of fondness and regard for, and somebody whose first book on the Kingdom of Travancore, The Ivory Throne, was eye-opening. And we've all seen now over the course of his earlier books distinctive features. He's thorough in his research. He has a point of view. He articulates it extremely well. He has a gift for anecdote and storytelling, which makes it so much more readable than many histories tend to be. And I have to say that this one, God's Guns and Missionaries, is clearly his most ambitious and audacious venture thus far. It's breathtaking in its historical sweep. It's bristling with scholarship, which explains what makes no less incredible and intimidating his 200 pages and more of footnotes, which are really not just source notes. There's a lot of interesting observation and insights in them. It's an exhilarating voyage down 400 years of Indian history. And, Manu is our hardworking, sedulous, ever reliable, often witty, and certainly vastly erudite guide. This, in many ways, is an investigative journey through the crucible in which modern Hinduism and its more muscular ethno-nationalist manifestations, Hindutva, were forged, in charting a course from the arrival of the Portuguese in India in the late 15th century to the inception of Hindutva with Savarkar's thesis just 100 years ago in the 20th. Manu Pillai has strived rigorously to scrutinize the makings of modern Hinduism and the modern Hindu identity. And he's tried wonderful things in this. Some of you know I trod similar ground to some degree in Why I'm a Hindu, which is a very personal evocation of my faith, what it meant to be, and to some degree addresses the question of its evolution from the sort of pristine Vedic forms through the influences of the Puranic era, the Upanishads, the revival by Adi Shankara, the Swami Vivekananda's extraordinary communication to people like me of the English medium types in the English language of what the faith is all about. And of course, in my own view, Mahatma Gandhi was a very great modern Hindu teacher as well. Manu doesn't get as far as the middle of the 20th century, but he's there for most of this period, and he starts off with the impact of the European missionaries here. So what's striking here is that that he examines how Hinduism has evolved or devolved, depending on how you see it, from a capacious, mind-bogglingly diverse, and I'm quoting him here, an ever-expanding tapestry of uncertain shape, to something more grand, linear, regimented, and restrictive, a narrative by the Hindutva movement, which to some of its more rigid believers is the only truth about Hinduism. And as we all know, Hinduism is a religion of multiple truths in every conceivable way, and Manu's extensive research, far more detailed, obviously, than what I've gotten in Why I'm a Hindu, will tell you a lot more, perhaps, than you can digest without going into the footnotes and getting some of the more detailed stories of them. He mentioned in an interview that I saw, that it was his first book to undergo a legal scrutiny, a legal read, that is, to check for anything that may cause offense in our intolerant and bigoted age. I have to say he's lucky, because my second book already went through that. That was The Great Indian Novel, and the same publisher, Viking Penguin, decided they actually had to get a lawyer to see what I was going to say that would cause offense. And I ruined a perfectly good relationship with the lawyer by contesting every one of his observations. But I don't know how Manu, whether he was more obliging or not. But the thing is that this is such a vastly ambitious project. He says the project is hopeless at best and controversial at worst, but he does try prodigiously to do justice to what he set himself as a vast task. And in my argument, he resoundingly triumphs in what he set out to do. In his ultimate analysis, he realizes that colonialism, and I'm quoting him again, seeded a feeling among many Hindus that their identity needed muscle. And in forging this defensive frame, he says, they would position themselves against the West and Muslims both. That colonialism gave Hinduism a new look is just another turn in a history full of reinvention. Yet its political consequence is also an exclusionary creed. Now, I've written in Why I'm a Hindu as to why I believe that such exclusionary, often fanatical and needlessly combative and narrow interpretations of Hinduism are a betrayal of the true nature of this faith. But Manu has demonstrated throughout the book that whenever different people try and distill what they claim to be the true nature of the faith, they come up with versions that are contestable from different points of view. But as Manu explains, in any case, the proponents of militant Hinduism faced, they would argue, with dangerous rivals in Islam and Christianity, felt that Hindus could not but fortify their new and unified identity. And he says something which I was not totally happy, but I think he is right to say it as an objective historian rather than one who's taken up cudgels in this battle. He says, in the modern age, which pushed political integration, introduced technology such as the press and the need to stand up to colonialism, new meaning was invested in broad-based labels. Two ideas appeared of the Indian nation: a pluralistic one with room for all, celebrating syncretic aspects of the Hindu-Muslim encounter. I'm sorry to say there is no footnote referring to my book, The Battle of Belonging, which actually lays this out in excruciating detail, far even longer than Manu's book. And another equating India with a Hindu nation, galvanized by memories of persecution by Muslim kings and Christian colonialists. And his last sentence of what made me a little troubled: logic could be found for both. Now, yes, I suppose if we have to be objective, logic can be found for whether the Hindutva point of view is more correct, or the liberal point of view, or the pluralistic point of view that I've advocated in my books is more correct. But that's something perhaps that we will see Ira Mukhoty and Manu also addressing in conversation. Ultimately, this book is a terrific saga. It's studded with truths both pleasant and unpleasant, realities both syncretic and strife-torn, of how, faced with frameworks introduced by sternly monotheistic religions, which had a different style of conceptualizing faith and identity, there was also, from the medieval period, an impulse to stitch up the borders, as it were, of this kaleidoscopic tapestry of Hinduism. In his words, to close the door, as it were, to give you a closed, agreed definition. Yet throughout God's Guns and Missionaries, Manu argues that if Hinduism weathered the challenges posed by colonial rule, and by over 700 years of Islamic rule before that, by continually assimilating new trends and reinterpreting and reforming itself, it is all because of its inherent plurality. To that degree, the objective historian ends up in my corner. Hinduism resisted and Hinduism prevailed only on account of being a composite of many traditions, epics, ways of life, and philosophies. At the same time, of course, Manu stresses and explains in detail that colonial pressures, along with the rise of nationalism, did lead to tendencies to classify, to regiment, and this also birthed, I'm quoting him again, where Hindu nationalism is concerned, a drive for homogenization. And homogeneity, he acknowledges, is alien to Hinduism. There's a lot there that I think Ira and I would enjoy talking about with the European impact, the reaction to the European impact, how Europeans saw Hinduism and how Hindus saw the way Europeans made them think about their own faith. All of that is there in some detail. It's startling, for example, to realize that Voltaire was a fan of the Vedas, this fierce French rationalist. And this whole question of, Vedic Hinduism versus Puranic Hinduism, is one more pure than the other. Many of you know, and even Why I'm a Hindu talks about Dayanand Saraswati's and Ram Mohan Roy's reinterpretations of Hinduism, which were very much a conscious effort to react to the European view of Hinduism and come up with something more acceptable to the Europeans. All of this, and I've got pages and pages of notes that I'm not going to inflict on all of you, but I did want to share one more thought, and I'll conclude then so we can have a larger conversation. In some ways, God's Guns and Missionaries is, of course, also the origin story of Hindutva. It is the saga of what paved the way to the hardline Hindu nationalism, the crackdown of politically backed, state-endorsed colonial evangelism on Hindu society, and the accompanying wounded vanity about India's Islamic past, exacerbated, as I've argued elsewhere, by the British politics of divide and rule, the partition of Bengal and the granting of separate electorates to Muslims. And so the Hindutvavadis, they were not the only ones rehauling Hinduism in the face of these forces of colonialism, some benign, some belligerent. The Hindutvavadis, however, are the ones who transmuted the faith into a regimented, restricted religion, a bulwark against colonial onslaughts and challenges to what they would prefer to have seen as a flat-out primacy of Hindus over India's Muslims and Christians. And so you've got all these forces, and Manu does great justice to them, the social reformers and crusaders for social justice, the Raja Ram Mohan Roy and Jyotiba Phule, Sri Narayana Guru, I'm working on his life and work. And all of these appear, and so do others, in Manu's analysis, as does, of course, to a lesser extent, because he's not talking so much about the pre-colonial period, the pre-European arrival period, but he also does mention how the face of Islam had led in reaction to the emergence of a sense of Hinduness. One thing that I particularly enjoyed his description of was how the so pure Vedic Hinduism, the Hinduism of the Nirguna Brahman, almost in some ways like the Muslim conception of God, God without shape, form, gender, without qualities, without smell, taste, voice. God is a spark, if you like, the universal Brahman. That's this very pure monotheistic idea of the divine, then changed under impact with real people, seeing how ordinary folks needed to have something to focus their worship on, instead of worshipping mountains and rivers and trees. And then the ways in which, as Hinduism expanded from its initial Vedic heartland, how it came into contact with other cultures, tribal forms of worship. I mean, Jagannath is a tribal deity in Puri, right? I mean, you've got all of these extraordinary things happening, and how Hinduism then became what we know of as Puranic Hinduism, where you had all these connections, absorptions, minglings, and at the same time redefinitions going on. And Manu has a lovely sentence in his introduction in which he talks of the purpose of Puranic universe. Let me quote the exact words, it's so beautifully written. To tie the local with the pan-Indian and the evolving with the stable, to universalize what was provincial while seeding the parochial with the universal. So that is what Hinduism found itself doing. And so this later Hinduism was not a corruption of some pristine, pure Vedic Hinduism. It was Hinduism in real life. And when the Europeans came, that's what they couldn't like. They were prepared to see the merit of some sort of pure, monotheistic, philosophical Vedic Hinduism. And they found the rest and all the gods and deities, the 330 crore forms of worship, of deities and imaginings that we had to worship. All of that, they were deeply bothered by that. And some of them reacted with ignorance and contempt. Some of them reacted with puzzlement, befuddlement. But in the process, don't forget, they were also the ruling power here. They were the ones who controlled the state, controlled the resources, controlled the weapons. And so Indians, particularly elite Indians, began to ask themselves, is our faith as bad as these guys say? Maybe we should really go back to the essential origins of our faith and not allow ourselves to be defined so badly, so contemptuously. Raja Ram Mohan Roy and the Brahmo Samaj, what's that all about? Some would critically say it's a Christianization of Hinduism. Some would say, no, it's a return to the essentials. But then you also have an opportunity to purge Hinduism of accretions that were universally derided in the light of the Enlightenment and the light of colonial education values. So Raja Ram Mohan Roy, Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar fighting against sati, fighting against the ban on widow remarriage, fighting against the ways in which Hinduism had allowed itself to adopt and use social practices that oppressed and enslaved. So all of these things are happening at the same time, and Hinduism in the process is evolving. And so you have the Brahmo Samaj, you have the Arya Samaj, you have other reform movements, the ones I've mentioned, Pillai, Narayana Guru, in Kerala alone, Ayyankali, Chattambi Swami. There's so many different Hindu thinkers within the Hindu faith redefining Hinduism. And so Manu seems to be implying Hindutva is another way of responding to all these forces. And that response is what we happen to be living with dramatically in the India that we are now all sitting and talking in. And that India is engaging with a Hinduism or a Hindutva which was shaped and fashioned over these 400 years of interaction, reaction, and of course confusion as well. But Manu does his very, very best to dispel confusion with his delightful writing. I'd like to congratulate you, Manu, on a terrific book, well worth the heft. I'm sure that it's going to do very well, and I'm here to wish it all success. And once again, congratulate the publishers and the author on a masterpiece. Thank you all very much. Jai Hind.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shashi Tharoor, for your interesting insights. And now that we have a sense of what the book is all about, I'm so sure we're going to be looking forward to the conversation even more. I invite today's moderator, author and historian, Ms. Ira Mukhoty, to deliver the opening remarks and commence the panel discussion with Dr. Tharoor and Manu S. Pillai, setting the stage for today's much-awaited panel discussion.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me? Lovely. Thank you for this lovely introduction from Prabha Khaitan. Thank you so much. Today I have witnessed, talking of religion and the rise of the Hindu identity, I witnessed a miracle here in Delhi, which is that Delhiites arrived on time. I've never seen anything like this, and it's clearly the rock star status of these two writers. So welcome everybody, and thank you for your patience. So something you may not know about Manu Pillai here is that he tends to be, when he's writing a new book, he's really guarded about what he's writing about. And I keep on trying to needle him along the years, like, give me some hint, Manu, what are you writing about? And he says nothing. And when I outright asked him just a direct question, like, what is the damn book about? He just laughed it off and shrugged it off. He never, ever told me what it was about. So the first I saw the book and knew what he had written about was when he did a cover reveal on social media. And I have to admit to having a very tiny moment of absolute terror when I saw the cover and I saw this triad of words in uneasy intimacy, gods, guns, and missionaries. I was like, what in the world? And the making of the modern Hindu identity. And I was terrified for an instant for him. But then I read the book, and of course I had no reason to be terrified for Manu at all. Because as Dr. Tharoor has so eloquently described it to us, the book is, of course, about the 400 years of shaping a Hindu identity in the cauldron of the European encounter. But for me, another thing which was really extraordinary about this book was the 50-page introduction. It is really a chef-d'oeuvre. It is a little masterpiece, a little jewel in which we go back 3,000 years. So Manu covers the 3,000 years leading up to those 400 years, which he will, of course, talk about in detail. But in those 3,000 years, he tells us how the very idea of a Hindu identity, how those ancient religious ideas came into this country. And this is a very contested idea at the moment. There are some who say it just sprang up just in the encounter with the Europeans. Before that, there was no shape. It was a sort of amorphous, shapeless thing that floated around. Others say, on the contrary, it was always present here. It was here in this pristine form from ancient times. It came along the Indo-Gangetic plains in a sort of miraculous, entity, and it never changed. It never, changed the outline of its form at all. It was altogether essential to itself. But Manu shows us that those 3,000 years was something altogether different. There was so much give and take. There was this idea that started morphing as it came into contact with all the different religions and thoughts and peoples and tribes that it encountered in India. So finally, I get to ask Manu this question. What drove you to write a book like this? Because I do sense a definite pivot in the ambition of this book, the scope of it, the things that you're trying to accomplish. What was the reason behind it? What drove you to it? And why this particular book right now?
Thank you, Ira. Thank you, Dr. Tharoor, for the wonderful speech. Thank you to everybody who's been here for a while and for patiently waiting for us to start. Very kind of you to stay. I see two very young readers at the back. Welcome. It's been, Ira, to answer your question, firstly, the reason the book has 220 or 30 pages of notes is because my very first book got me a 5 crore defamation notice. Okay. And what helped me sort of ward it off was the fact that I had extensive notes, that I had sources backing up almost every claim, almost every sentence in the book. And I think I've done that again here because I'm aware that while one can say what one needs to say, and all credit to Penguin, they did send the book for a legal read, but they did not inflict or force me to do anything that I didn't want to do. It was entirely left to me whether to accept or reject the changes the lawyer suggested, and I think I made only a couple of changes here and there, which was again just paraphrasing or rewording, but not censoring anything. But because the climate we live in is oversensitive, and we've turned taking offense into a kind of national sport, I thought it makes sense to have solid footnotes so that even if I'm sued, I have something to hold up. But so far the reviews have been great. Just yesterday we had a review in the Asian Review of Books saying that this is a book that will speak to both the left and the right. And I think that's perhaps a good thing if people on both sides find something to appreciate in the book, and if they're also uniformly offended by parts of the book, that's also okay. The problem is when one group is offended and not the other. As to your words on the introduction, in a podcast I was mentioning, and it's not in the book, but in my own family temple in Kerala, our ancestral temple, we've got a series of gods. They all sit in one compound now. One is the original Vanadurga, which is a goddess of the grove, who needs to be exposed to the elements, to the air, to the rain and all of that. And therefore, even if you build a temple to the goddess, the roof is left hollow because the water has to fall on her. Next to her, we have a Bhadrakali, who has a covered roof and a slightly different set of rituals. Alongside them, we have an ancestor worshipped somewhere. I had a great-great-grandmother whose sister passed away because a dog bit her, and then she got rabies and died. And then her Atma was apparently sort of, drawn into this round stone and put there. And Mrs. Janaki, as her name was, she's also stuck in the temple in that round stone to this day. We had a serpent grove. The grove was destroyed, but the serpent deities were moved into the temple. We had two Dalit communities nearby, Koravars and Pollayars. The Koravars had a deity called Ira Mukhoty. Ira Mukhoty is also in the temple. The Pollayars had their grove. That deity was abandoned over a period of time. No more alcohol, no more blood sacrifices. And that deity, Murti, was also brought into the temple and lives in the same compound now. And although now Murti receives Brahminical worship with milk and flowers and honey, even now, before the main puja and every year happens in the temple, we need to... I've seen uncles sort of shuffling around with a black bag of alcohol, which they go and keep somewhere, I think, or pass it on to somebody of that community, because they still have to pay lip service to that traditional custom, which is that Murti needs booze and alcohol to be worshipped. And they all sit in one compound. And you can tell that they all have different personalities, they have different histories, different groups of people worship them. And it's not as if they've all been subsumed into one identity. Their identities are still distinct, but the fabric that they occupy, that framework that they occupy, that is what is Hinduism. And that, as Dr. Tharoor was saying, is defined in a great way by Puranic stories and legends. Because even this temple, if you try to explain why all these gods are sitting there, through legends and stories that people explain it. And that really for me was my experience of Hinduism. It wasn't scripture. It wasn't anybody reading the Bhagavad Gita every day. It wasn't someone chanting verses from the Vedas. It was the lived everyday experience of people going to a temple that had all of these diverse things happening. Even a major temple like Sridangam in Tamil Nadu. In that town, there's a series of temples there. And one of the temples I went, again, very Brahmanical to look at. But in the middle of the afternoon, a man dressed as a woman, and she's called the Amman, because in that time, the Amman is a female. He walks in, and I think there's a cow, and then they do a bunch of rituals around the cow, and it's very quiet. He's doing these rituals, and the moment he moves his hand, everybody sort of touches the cow, and they try to sort of get a bit of that sandal paste or whatever. You can again tell that is not a custom that came from some pristine Vedic, with some pristine Vedic origin. It clearly was a local custom that was also incorporated into the temple rituals. So that is the story I set out to tell, and that is what, transfixed me from the time I was quite young. And the idea for this book really came when I was very young, in 2011, just before I wrote that email to Dr. Tharoor asking for a job. I did my master's dissertation, which was on Hindu nationalism. As a 21-year-old, my opinions were still, I wouldn't say raw, but they were very led by other people's literature. I was reading other books, I was reading other texts, and I was sort of condensing all that, and I had a sense of what Hindu nationalism was. And that's where the idea really picked up. And then 2019, I thought I'd do a book on it. 2020, I did 4 chapters of this book, realized that, including that introduction, but then thought that I needed more time and space to come back to it because it was a bit overwhelming, and then finished the book earlier this year. So it's been a 12-year journey almost of putting this together.
So I got my answer at last then. Yes. No, what you bring out really in such vivid detail is the adaptability of the Brahminical tradition. I was just delighted to find that there's something called the Skanda Purana that you talk about, that if there's any story or myth that they don't really like, they don't know what the origin of it is, there doesn't seem to make any sense in their great, in the overview of the Brahminical tradition, they just dump it into this so-called scrap heap of Purana and say it's part of the Skanda Purana. And anything they don't like, they seem to attribute to the Kali Yuga, and they'll be like, okay, well, it's the Kali Yuga, so how can you expect things to be so pristine, and pure? And you also describe, it's very fascinating that the rise and the sort of, the tradition of the great epics, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, they seem to be in this intermediate place between the sort of very philosophical Vedas and a way to translate those very high ideals for the common person, for a lived reality. Is that the way that you saw it when you wrote about it?
I think it's very obvious, right? You read the epics and you see that they were written over multiple centuries. It wasn't like one person sat down at one moment and finished it in a year. You take someone like the late Bibek Debroy, and he talks about how it took multiple centuries to put this together in the definitive form that we recognize it. Even then, there were lots of differences in the different Ramayanas and Mahabharats that existed of the standard version. It was only in the 20th century that they created the critical versions of this by looking at whatever was common in all these narratives and putting that together as the definitive epics. So
but
yes,
they acknowledge the recension.
They do.
Southern recension and
very much. And we are Malayalis, Dr. Tharoor and I, and in Kerala we have something even called the Mappala Ramayana, which is the Muslim version of the Ramayana, where Shurpanakha propositions Rama, and when he says, no, sorry, I've got a wife, she says, that's okay, Sharia allows you to take a second wife. So you have a Sharia quoted in one version of the Ramayana in Kerala as well. So it is diverse. You can see that different impulses have been drawn into the epics. And that's the other thing that really unites Hindu society, right? In different parts of India, you'll see people have different languages, their temple customs vary, the look of the temple varies, their practices, languages, all of that changes. But in all corners of India, whether it's tribal belts or the so-called, fertile belts in Tamil Nadu or wherever, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata are the constants. Those stories always exist everywhere. And through that, people have been able to also construct a sacred geography. So they have a sense of what India is, what their homeland is, and they're able to sort of draw it all together.
So this idea of a sacred geography, that's also fascinating, and something, I was reading about in your book, is that this was a religion which initially had no idea of a temple, of a fixed space. They came with their, sacred fires, with their sacrifices, their extended rituals, and Brahminical supremacy, but there was no idea of having a temple or temple worship. So how did they adjust? Is it because they had to adjust to the many, local traditions which believed in a personified God?
The Greeks brought the temple idea, didn't they?
Well,
to begin with.
there are lots of theories on it. Some people say that the Greeks did introduce something and that went through Buddhism and Jainism. They picked it up first and then the temple came in. But I think I'd flip it a little one way, which was that there was the Vedic religion of the Brahmins, which has always been there, and that was the pristine philosophical faith, the fire sacrifices, the rituals, all of that, but no images. In fact, parts of the Vedas criticize the idea of idol worship, which allows Dayananda Saraswati later in the 19th century to also criticize idol worship. But as this culture is fanning across India, there are already cults and groups in India that are worshipping images. This is why in Maharashtra, which is where I grew up, you'll often go to these temples and you'll see these Devi images where there's a carved image on top, on a pedestal. But right at the base, you'll see a cruder image because that was the original deity. And over a period of time, as the temple got bigger, people's ambitions changed, they had a sense of aesthetics, a carved sort of figure was installed on top. But the other one wasn't abandoned either. So people did have faith in images. The temple in its proto form did exist in groves and local shrines.
Right.
And this confluence, this interaction between the Brahminical vision of God and this existing ground up tradition of idol worship is what forges and creates Puranic Hinduism. That's why Puranic Hinduism is a composite. Essentially, when we're talking about the Vedic religion, it isn't necessarily that first there were the Vedas, then there was the Puranic system. In some ways, it's the Vedic system and local systems merging that births the Puranic system. And that is what I would call Hinduism as we know it today.
Right. And even so, when we start, so this is still just the introduction, by the way. We are just discussing the introduction. But if we are to go on to start looking at the interaction with the Europeans and with politically backed Christianity when it comes to India, there's a lot of diversity, obviously, in the way in which these systems, these European nations will interact with the Hinduism that they find on the ground. And so that explains, and you bring it out in your book, why the Portuguese in particular are so violent. It's because there are, the dynamics happening in Europe. There's the Reformation of the 16th century, which has entirely changed, the Catholic Church versus the Protestant system. So how did that influence the way in which the Portuguese sort of set up shop in India?
I wrote the introduction and I thought, okay, maybe the right wing will cancel me for the introduction. Then I wrote the first chapter and I thought, the left is going to cancel me for this chapter. Because, the early Europeans who came to India had very strange, garbled ideas about the East in general. Partly because as Christianity itself spread in its early phases, including into Europe, this was a time when Europe had pagan gods, they were worshipping trees, they were sacrificing animals. They developed this way of explaining it in that Christianity and the Bible show you the way to God as in the God. And everything else that you're seeing in image worship in these groves is basically satanic images. This is all representations of the devil. And therefore, they brought that same framework to India, which is that idol worship is essentially a worship of devils. Of course, it wasn't helped by the fact that, they'd go into places and see images of Narasimha, this rather scary looking figure, ripping open another human being and think, how could this be God? It doesn't make sense. This has to be an agent of the devil. They'd go into places Kali, they'd see Devi temples, and you have a God in this dark sanctum. There's lamps and all of that around, but pretty fearsome to look at. So they were convinced that they were looking at monsters. And that was their way of making sense of the Hindu world, that this was a world of monster-worshipping, devil-worshipping people. And they had to sort of civilize them and bring Christian light to them. And again, I'm not saying this in a blame them kind of way. It's just that they came from that worldview, and these people here in India had their own worldview. The Protestant Reformation, what you refer to, is initially when the Portuguese come into Goa and they're ruling in Goa. For the first several decades, they're at peace with Hindus. There isn't that kind of religious animosity. They have their cliches, but again, Hindus also had their cliches about white people, by the way. There's one wonderful one where they thought white people like to fry children in butter and eat them. Even Shah Jahan complained that white people were not civilized and they were barbaric because they didn't wash their bottoms after going to the toilet. So Indians were not backward when it came to having cliches about white people either. But because the Protestant Reformation picked up in Europe, and the Protestants attacked the Catholic Church, saying that the Catholic Church is idolatrous, that they are not actually worshipping Christ or God in his real sense. They are also, they've corrupted Christianity and turned it into a form of idolatry. So the Catholic Church was now on the defensive. And in India, they had all these pagans And it was easy for them to make an example of the pagans to demonstrate in Europe that, look, we are committed Christians. We are genuine Christians attacking actual idolaters on the ground in an Eastern country.
On that, and though I can't claim to have read every word in the book, and I've read as much of it
Is your
as I
mic
could,
working, sir?
I don't see the Synod of Diemper showing up, which was is it there?
On the Nasranis?
No, this is the Synod decreed by the Archbishop in Goa to root out Hindu practices that had infiltrated.
I may
into
not
the
have used the exact term, but yes, it is referred to there.
Okay,
Yeah.
so that the fact that they were writing lamps and they had songs in the church and so on, all that was ruthlessly sent. And of
Yes.
course, the texts of the Nestorians were
Yes.
burned and all sorts of things. But so that kind of syncretism that Hinduism had was brought into Christianity in its initial practice and then ruthlessly and consciously stamped out.
Very much. In fact, that's the other thing. The Portuguese in Goa were not just against the Hindus that they saw in Goa. In Kerala, they did persecute the Nasranis or the local Christians of Kerala. Because local Christians firstly didn't pay homage to the Pope. They were not interested that much in Catholicism at that time. They had their own traditions. In many ways, they behaved like a Hindu caste group. Even now, in the most orthodox faction of the Nasranis, they have rituals where the bridegroom and the bride will be sort of washed in haldi before a wedding. They'll enter the house with a lamp after getting married. Very Hinduized kind of customs. And they said this isn't Christianity either. But that's the thing. If you look at that first chapter, it's power that always tilts this, right? In Goa, the Portuguese were in power, and therefore they pushed not only a Christianization, but a Europeanization. You know, they wanted even the Kerala Christians to start imitating them. They wanted the Hindus who were converting to start imitating them culturally. But then you find that these missionaries are also traveling to Hindu courts. And there the debates are happening on more equal terms because there's actual debate happening. It isn't just, power being misused. So in Calicut, for example, you have a missionary, I think Father Fenicio, who comes up and they've done their homework. By now they've realized that, okay, this isn't just monster worship because people aren't converting despite the light of the Bible being shown to them. They clearly have some theology. They clearly have some sense of logic to their religion. So then they start studying Hindu scripture and these debates begin. And in Calicut, it's quite funny. Fenicio will say things like, oh, you've got a god like Krishna. What does he do? Runs around with gopis. This isn't a dignified god. You've got Ganapati. He's got this giant belly. He's got the head of an elephant and he moves around on a rat. How can this be God? But the Hindus are also doing their homework. So you find that they respond saying that, okay, we accept what you're saying about our gods. But if Jesus was really divine, how could the Jews have put him up on a cross and killed him? That doesn't make logical sense. If you don't believe in idol worship, how is it that you have processions of the Virgin Mary? And isn't that idolatry? So there the debates are happening on more equal terms. And here you see Christianity shape-shifting in South India. So Roberto de Nobili in Madurai goes there and essentially converts Christianity into, by then, there's the notion that Christianity is the Parangi Vedam. Parangi is Tamil for Firangi or the Europeans Vedam. And the idea is the Firangis are nasty people. They drink because they're looking at sailors. They drink, they're violent, they're here to cause trouble. So their Vedam or religion is not for anybody dignified in India. And Nobili says, no, think of the Bible as the Satya Vedam, the Bible of the truth or the Veda of the truth. Think of it as the fifth Veda, just as you have 4 Vedas. And he presents himself as a kind of Italian Brahmin and acquires the sacred thread, wears saffron robes, becomes a vegetarian, gets food only cooked by Brahmins for himself to the extent that he goes back to Goa at one point and refuses to have food with his own seniors, saying that you're all Parangis, I can't eat with you because now I'm an upper caste local Christian in India, so I have to behave like an upper caste Brahmin. And he makes some headway but what you see is the Christianity that he is selling in Tamil Nadu is no longer European Christianity. It's been in many ways Hinduized and Brahminized, and people are allowed to bring their caste into it. So if a Brahmin converts, he gets to wear his sacred thread, except that Nobili will put a little cross on it. As a little locket or something like that, he'll hang a cross on it. In the church itself, upper caste Christians get to sit in front, lower caste Christians are kept near the door. So he sort of internalizes a lot of Hindu ideas and sort of turns Christianity into something else. That's why power, as I said, matters. Because in Portuguese Goa, where the Portuguese and the Christian rulers had power in their hands, they were able to push a much more sort of hardline Christianity. But where it was under Hindu rulers and where power was still on the side of the native, it was Christianity that adapted and had to make certain changes.
So it was their political power that enabled, that prevented Christianity from becoming another Hindu sect.
Exactly, yeah, eventually. And that's where the British come in. In fact, even now in South India, you will see Christian fathers wearing a shade of saffron. They have tikas. They still have caste segregation.
Yeah.
I have a citation from a 2009 or 10 Times of India article where Dalit Christians were complaining that they are still made to bury their dead in separate cemeteries, not in the main cemetery, because they're seen as low caste Christians. So you have all of that in South Indian Christianity, in parts of South India to this day. But the question on power, the reason I mentioned it is, this also links up to the Hindutva anxiety around power, which is that it's not about other religions, it is about who controls the state. And some of this anxiety comes from this part of history, this sliver of history where power determined what shape that religious interaction took.
And the conversions that happened.
And conversions,
that, right? Because
yes.
the numbers really happened at that time in that area. So, moving on from the Portuguese, then we have the 18th century and the British East India Company. And of course, initially, they are not at all interested in proselytizing. They're not interested in bringing in missionaries at all. They are here just for trade to make money. But what's interesting is that it is the very colonial enterprise that these nabobs who return with all this obscene wealth and this sort of very flashy lifestyle, the scandal of Hastings impeachment trials, all these excesses sort of bring about evangelical Protestantism to a much larger extent, and this will in turn shape the way in which missionaries are allowed slowly to come into India and start their activities here.
Yeah, by the 18th century, you firstly start seeing even more interesting debates among the missionaries. Firstly, Protestant missionaries have now entered the country. And here again, the Christian missionaries are not a monolith. As I said, just as in Goa, you've got very hardline Europeanized Christians, in Madurai, you've got very Brahmanized Christians. So already the Catholics are split into two or three different types. Now the Protestants come in and they don't get along with the Catholics. So the Catholics are going around telling all the converts that, look, these guys are not actually Christians, don't lump us together. The Protestants say, no, the Catholics are the one who've corrupted the faith, come to us, we will give you actual legit Christianity. So they're also fighting. It's not like they're one group. And these Protestant fathers, there's this wonderful character called Bartholomew Ziegenbach, who in the early 18th century actually engages in correspondence with a bunch of Hindus. Because he comes in thinking this is a barbaric country and a barbaric religion. But within months of arriving here, he says, hold on, there's something wrong. As I talk to them, I realize that just as we study Aristotle, they've got the Tirukural. This is all happening in Tamil Nadu. Just as we have a conception of a supreme deity who's formless, they have a conception of a supreme deity who's formless. So then he's curious. And finally, his curiosity leads him to write a bunch of reports, including one called The Genealogy of the Indian Gods. And his bosses in Europe write him a stinker saying that your job is to spread Christianity in India, not to spread heathenish nonsense in Europe. So no need to do all these researches on Hinduism. But those debates are interesting because you find, not just with Ziegenbach, but in different centuries, you find that often the way the Hindus respond is the same. The missionary will come in saying that the Bible is God's word and this is the way to find him, to reach God. And the Hindus will respond often with the same arguments. One is, if it was God's word meant for everyone, why didn't God give it to us directly? That means God is omnipotent, universal, all-loving. So God would not single out one group of people in Europe with his actual word and then leave all of us out. So they would say, no, God is like a shopkeeper. Just as a shopkeeper has multiple products to get everyone to his counter, God has created different paths. So for Hindus and brown people here, this is the way you've done it. God has done it. For you people in Europe, he's come with the Bible. Just as Jesus was born among you to save you, God was born here in Vishnu's 10 avatars to save us. So we are not saying that your religion is bad or not valid. We are only saying it is valid for you. For us, we already have a path and therefore we don't need to convert. You find this argument repeating constantly. There's this traveler called Francois Bernier. He comes across a bunch of Brahmins doing their morning sandhya, where they're doing their water rituals, standing knee deep in water. And he says, look, this can't have been mandated by God because, in cold Europe, you'd freeze to death doing all this. And they're not disarmed by his blinding logic. They say, yeah, that's fine. This is for us in our tropical climate. For you in Europe, you can have your own this thing. God has created multiple ways. So that's by the 18th century, you find that the Hindus are sort of responding. But at this time, it's still not the colonial era so much. Even though British power is slowly growing, power is still in the hands of assorted Hindu Rajas. The local Muslim rulers have already anyway made their peace with Hindu society. So they think that the scales are still in sort of in favor of the Hindus. They don't feel that political threat. With the British, as you were saying, initially, of course, British officials wanted nothing to do with religion. You find that they, at one point, English officials are going around smashing coconuts in temples. They're escorting deities in procession. They're making donations. Tirupati, Thomas Munro makes a donation. Your constituency, Trivandrum, Colonel Munro, John Munro makes donations to the Padmanabha Swami temple.
The East India Company doesn't even let a bishop into India until 1820.
Exactly.
They were not at all like the Spanish who wanted to spread the mission of Christianity. They came to make money.
Very much. In fact, when they conquered Puri, and I have a bit in one chapter which begins with the conquest of Orissa, and how when they go into Puri, the thing they're most concerned about is maintaining the sanctity of the Puri temple. And they want to show the Brahmins of Puri that, look, we're even better than the Marathas who we just dislodged, and we will patronize you. And the Brahmins reciprocate. They write the Governor General, Lord Wellesley, I think, this grand letter saying that till you came, we were suffering under the Marathas, and you have now liberated us. And we hope the Puri continues forever. That's an actual quote. Continues forever under the company. So there is a sense that, okay, both sides are sort of weighing their options, they're figuring each other out. But the British do not want to get into politics or into religion. It's only 1813 there, Europe comes in again, which was that after the Enlightenment, which was about rationalism, reason, all of that, there is a backlash. In many ways, I was telling someone the other day, just as in India we had Nehruvian secularism, and in many ways Hindutva is a kind of backlash, or they present themselves as a backlash to that. You have this feeling in Europe coming up that after the rationalism of the Enlightenment, Voltaire and all those philosophers dissing religion, dissing Christianity, there is a backlash where now there's a new Christianity bubbling up, an evangelical one where it's not priests, but people bottom up, cobblers, carpenters, they are the new evangelical agents who are coming up. So that's happening in Europe. Similarly, the Industrial Revolution, it brings around all these changes in local society, new classes are emerging, and just as in India after liberalization we have a new flowering of religious identity, so too the Industrial Revolution leads to a religious flowering in British society. So now Parliament is under pressure. People in Britain are now being pressured to allow missionaries into India. 1813, they finally say, okay, fine, missionaries can come, but local officials will determine how far. If they misbehave, if people are upset, they'll sort of expel them from there. By the 1830s, missionaries are given free access. And that's where the debates start getting even more anxious. And by the 1830s, you find that in places like Bombay, thousands of people are gathering on by the beach and people are having public debates. You know, Banaras, Bombay, all of the major centers, Hindus and Christian missionaries are sitting and having debates. And frankly, this book deserves a companion book because the same thing is happening with the Muslim community also. Muslims are also debating Christian missionaries, and they are also coming up with similar arguments, challenging the virgin birth of Jesus and things like that. They're also trying to puncture holes in Christianity. Because for all the communities in India, the missionary is now beginning to look like a threat because the British state is now actively, at least from where they're sitting, it looks like the British state is permitting the missionaries to come.
But you mustn't forget the reason the British allowed the missionaries to come is because they had become a source of massive criticism of British colonialism in England.
Yeah.
They were essentially condemning the greed, rapacity, cupidity, exploitation being conducted by the East India Company as amoral and unchristian. And so the East India Company had to bring these guys on board. And that's why they were allowed to come into India.
Exactly, the pressure.
It was actually not the sort of allied project of we are there to serve your cause. It's come and see we are not that bad.
I mean, at one level though it flips in that you find this earlier generation that's not happy at all about missionaries. We have one Governor General even defending the fact that the British are patronizing Hinduism by saying that, you know, just as any government would protect a brothel. We don't agree with Hinduism, but just as the government would protect a brothel and the prostitutes and maintain their security, so too we will protect Hinduism, because he's trying to make sure that the missionary pressure can be resisted. But eventually the pressure is too much and people come in. And the way the Hindu society sort of responds is also quite amusing. The other day on Monday at a talk, I gave one example. You find this story emerging in North India, which is that, because now Christianity is real. It's become a force that people are worried about. And they need to locate it in their worldview. So there's this story that emerges where the Hindu says, Hinduism is doing so well that all the Hindus are being saved and their souls are all going to heaven. So now heaven is overpopulated and the hell is facing a depopulation. So cosmic balance is lost. Hell has nobody in it now because the Hindu religion is catering to everyone. So to restore cosmic balance, God has now introduced Christianity so as to waylay some people and send their souls to hell. Like that's the narrative that they create, because it's accommodating or putting Christianity in their worldview, but in a negative sense. Similarly, anxiety about the British seemingly supporting the missionaries also grows. You start seeing that at Ramleela performances, where you shoot the final arrow at Ravana's effigy, Ravana suddenly dressed in the costume of the English East India Company Governor General, and Ravana's soldiers are dressed like company soldiers. It isn't street agitation, it isn't mobilized agitation, but it is a way people are showing that they are resisting a lot of this. And people respond with written tracts. There's these public debates that are taking place. And then, of course, by 1840s, you already see a nationalistic kind of articulation coming up. There's a young chap called Bhaskar Bandurang. Long before Dadabhai Nauroji's economic drain theory, he makes the same point. Guy in his 20s. He's only in his 20s. He's learnt the English language, trained in the Western style, writes a critique of British economic policy in 6 letters in the Bombay Gazette. At one point, he says that you say you've liberated us from Islamic rule. At least under Islamic rule, if we converted to Islam, we used to get some, material benefits from it. With you, we convert, but your racism prevents us from getting any sort of advantages from conversion. So what is the point? Then he says that, you claim that you've saved us from the depredations of marauders and invaders, but your system of taxation is so oppressive that every day it's sort of, extracting all our blood from us and basically leaving us dry. So he articulates by the 1840s, even before the 1857 rebellion, in writing in the English language, a defense of India, but also the Hindu religion in some ways. So you see that by then there's a kind of picking up of animosity. And that is where you see that sense originally appearing that Hindu society has to regiment itself. It has to have some way of responding to the missionary and the missionary's attacks, including attacks on temples and gods and all of that.
But I think also one of the really interesting observations you made, Manu, is a very forgotten, effect of colonialism is the political mobilization of the subaltern classes. Yes. To use the colonial power to get some advantage vis-a-vis their, the hierarchical superiors in the Brahminical tradition. So people like Jyotirbai Phule, and I think this might be one of our last discussion points. We may be running out of time. So can you tell us a little bit more about this extraordinary man and his wife, Savitribai, and how they used colonialism to try and advance the cause of the subaltern classes?
So again, the missionary, as much as established Orthodox and upper caste Hindus hated the missionary project because they saw a threat in it and they rallied to sort of defend Hinduism and the Hindu identity, missionaries also in many ways allowed access to education for the first time, really, modern education to Dalits. Their schools were opened up to Dalits. Now there was a way. They also gave in many ways a conceptual framework for marginalized communities to assert themselves politically. Again, not necessarily because they intended it that way. That's the one point I make throughout the book, which is that often the missionaries intend something, but the way Indian society actually appropriates it and reinvents it is entirely because of Indian agency. They had a lot of say and control in how they applied all of these things. And Jyotirbai Phule was one of those figures. Went to a mission school, learned the English language, read Thomas Paine's The Rights of Man and texts of that nature. He wasn't a Dalit, but he realized very early on that caste was going to be a handicap, and caste was not something that could be justified in the modern period. And he uses the same missionary critique in order to excoriate Hinduism from within. That is, just as Hindus were trying to stand up and reform Hinduism against the Christian missionary, Phule was the kind of reformer who wanted changes within power structures in Hinduism as opposed to merely looking at the oppressor outside. He said there's plenty of oppression within. What are we going to do about that? And that's what leads up to Ambedkar in a later generation. So it's quite interesting that both he and Raja Ram Mohan Roy appropriate the missionary language. So Raja Ram Mohan Roy also, just as missionaries make fun of Krishna and Ganapati and the so-called sensuality of the Hindu religion, Ram Mohan Roy takes this, internalizes it, but uses it to reclaim a kind of pristine Vedic, philosophical, metaphysical Hinduism, from the Upanishads. That's what he wants. So he also actually, in Ram Mohan Roy's also, you'll find him writing almost like a missionary. And often these reformers were called missionaries in brown skin and brown men's clothing. And Phule does the same thing. He also appropriates a lot of the missionary criticism, except he still doesn't champion conversion. So he has a play, I think, in which there's a missionary who goes and there's a couple, I think they're farmers, and a Brahmin comes and hoodwinks them. And it's a caricatured Brahmin. The Brahmin's just interested in the money. He prescribes all kinds of ceremonies, tries to make a quick buck from these illiterate peasants. And a missionary comes and he sort of opens their eyes. But the end of it is not their conversion. In Phule's story, at the end, they actually go to study in Phule's school. So he says, great, the missionaries opened your eyes, but now come and get education. It's not as if he's endorsing conversion, even though his critics said that he was a missionary in Hindu clothing. So again, Indians were using both Western criticism as well as Western studies on Hinduism to their own advantage to reinvent, reframe, and come up with a new way of sort of defining Hinduism for the modern age.
That's so fascinating, Manu. I think we could be here a lot longer discussing this amazing, amazing book with both these speakers. But I think we are running out of time.
Manu S. Pillai will be happy to take a few questions from the audience.
Thanks, Manu, for a fantastic exposition. I'm Dr. Pawan Dugal, Advocate Supreme Court and cyber law expert. Now, I jump from your point where your book finishes till today. Now with the coming of this new cyberspace, new digital paradigms, and the new formation of the new modern identity, do we think is it new narratives, or is it only a reiteration of the traditional Hindu identity in a new digital context? The perspectives of the various panelists.
You first.
Look, I mean, the Hindu identity has to come to terms with the world in which it is to be found. And so just as when Savarkar articulated Hinduism in the form of Hindutva, it was an era in which, first of all, there was much more race consciousness in the world, which is why he refers to the Hindu race, though arguably Hindus are not a race in any logical sense of that term. And the RSS is founded about the same time. He wrote Essentials of Hindutva in 23, RSS founded in 25. And what's happening in the world at that time? You've got people running around in brown shirts and khaki shorts and conducting exercises and being militarized. And that's exactly what the RSS also does. So each time you can look at a place in the context of the circumstances and forces in the world around it and see how that relates to what it is. So if today the world is subsumed with cyberspace and AI and different kinds of networks and so on, Hindutva will have to come to terms with that and figure out a way of asserting itself within that context. And that context is one, just as I think there's a quote in Manu's book about how some Europeans said that education, by which they meant English education, would de-Hinduize the Hindu. You see, by distancing himself from all that his faith taught him to cherish. Similarly, you could argue, though in fact the British didn't spend much on education, that's a different issue, but that was the logic behind even educating Hindus. Similarly, you could argue that in terms of adjusting to the modern world today, you might end up moving the Hindu away from these traditional sources of his identity, which is what Hindutva needs to privilege in order to get that Hindu to vote for Hindutva. Now, in this context, there are two things happening simultaneously. Yes, you do have adjustments to the cyber world and AI and the modern rhetoric of the 21st century, but you also have evocations of history, the wrongs done by the Muslims, dig up every mosque around because it was built on a temple, all of that happening at the same time. Is that very 21st century? One would argue not, but it's also happening.
I'll just add to say that technology and religion is a fascinating, phenomenon. The very beginning of this book is about the Maharaja of Jaipur going to England, and he's been told that you're an upper caste Hindu, you shouldn't be crossing the Kala Pani and going abroad. And then he says, look, I have to. It's the coronation of my boss, the King Emperor in England, so I can't say no to this invitation. So the Brahmins say, okay, fine. If you have to go, then we'll come up with a way. And the way is what they say that, of course, you've got to get a brand new ship that's not been defiled. You've got to carry Ganga Jal. You've got to take cows with you so you can drink Hindu milk, all of that. English cows don't count. But the final thing is, you will not be going. Your deity, Sri Gopalji, is going to England. And as a follower, you're only following the deity. So even when he lands in Britain, the deity is placed in the front carriage and he follows in another carriage because he's literally following his deity into England. So he gets what he wants, but he also has this facade of maintaining religion. Technology in other ways. There's a quote I often use from a book by Maria Mishra called Vishnu's Crowded Temple, where she talks about how the railways came, and initially everybody was upset. They thought the railways were the fire carriage. They would lose caste if they traveled on the railways. Then, for example, they realized that instead of traveling for weeks from Calcutta to Puri, you could get to Puri in 12 hours on the train. And suddenly the train ended up boosting the pilgrim traffic to Puri, and Hindu religiosity flowered using that technology. Even now, if you look at Hindutva, much as we don't like what they're doing, it is on the back of the internet, it is on the back of technology that this new Hindutva is flowering up. There's a book called Hindutva Pop that's discussing some of this. So basically, it's interesting that technology comes in. Often you'll find the orthodox people sort of initially suspicious and rejecting it, but then it gets co-opted and used in a very creative, strange, sometimes weird ways by those same religions and people speaking for those religions. So I think with AI we'll see something interesting.
Kunal Purohit's book on Hindutva Pop is about a lot of these modern, styles of music, the Hindi equivalents of rap and so on, which is going that way, and which at the same time is advocating Hindutva. But on trains, the critique goes back to Savarkar himself. Wrote that the moment the coal-fired train started running, some Hindus started discovering trains in the Vedas.
Yeah.
So, and he was critical of that. But the fact is that you can take technology and apply it to your own heritage if you want to.
Can we take a question from that side? Oh, yeah. One from either side.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. And of course, such a pleasure to see the three wonderful authors together, a pleasant evening anyone can afford. My name is Arshali, and I'm from Allahabad, the city of Nehru, and the one who epitomized secularism and pluralism. Now, the question is something very much personal, because it's a concern that haunted me since years, and of course, I would like to have the authors answer that concern. That being born into a family where my father's side, the Rajputs converted to Islam, my Nani side, the Kashmiri Pandits, Nana's Punjabi Sikh. And I was like the guinea pig of the house, undergoing the Upanan as the Brahmins would do, all the sanskars as the Muslims have, of the Sikhs have, so very much in the position of the Italian Brahmin. Educated at Oxford, also done a Shastri in Sanskrit, learned the Quran, Arabic, Persian, Amil, Kamil, Fazil, the different things. The concern is that when I see a social media post, I see that all of that learning and that culture and that syncretism goes for a toss. So, should I be more concerned about the rage of parochialism that's coming up in Hinduism or Hindutva for particular? Or should I be more concerned about the reaction to that particular parochialism among certain sections of the Muslim society, or even, for God's sake, any other society? Like, what should be our foremost concern to address issues like these? Or should we say that rather pluralism is a better option to solve problems like these?
Well, I think you can be concerned about both, but I think, yes, pluralism is the better option in general. If you are in a diverse country and you, as you yourself said, have multiple identities in your own family, obviously, I think we would all endorse pluralism as a way to sort of live together.
One last question, a quick one on that side. Just 2 minutes, okay? We just have 2 minutes left.
Manu, in the book, hi. In the book, you've said change is coded into Hinduism's DNA. So could you expound on that a little bit? How do you see it changing today, the DNA? Just towards Hindutva, or do you see something else rising?
I think Hindutva is the political sort of manifestation of it, right? I think even Savarkar, you find this quest to define Hindutva, it predates Savarkar. Some people have the sense that Savarkar woke up one fine morning and sort of invented Hindutva in his, Essentials of Hindutva, who is a Hindu. But that was merely a kind of enduring articulation that he was able to put together in the 1920s. There was already a quest to define Hindutva for some time before that in Bengal, Maharashtra. Tilak tried to define Hindutva, except his definition of Hindutva is you have to believe in the Vedas, you have to believe in multiple paths to God, that kind of thing. So clearly you see that there was an effort to try and understand what this meant from before Savarkar's time. But when I say change is coded into its DNA, it's not merely Hindutva, it is also that religions do keep evolving over a period of time. To give you an example from the Christian world, just as the early missionaries came 500 years ago to Goa and said that no, the Bible and Christianity are the only ways to God, I think a few weeks ago the Pope himself in Singapore or someplace said that actually there are multiple ways to God. So it's interesting that in 500 years, the Supreme Pontiff of Catholicism is able to make a statement like that. It's not dogmatic in the way it was earlier. He's able to shift and come up with a new perspective, right? And that's natural to all religions. All religions have changes. But the thing is, some changes we may like because of our own conditioning. Other changes we may not like. And that's why when Dr. Tharoor was saying it in his speech, which is that, even Hindutva is a change. It's a change you and I may not like. But it is a change that has happened because of historical processes. And that's what I try to investigate in the book. Where is this impulse for Hindutva born? Where does it come from? So that change can take multiple forms. And these multiple forms then jostle for space and try to see which one will prevail. And inevitably something will prevail over the other. I think for the time being, what worries me is this push towards homogenization, which is one type of Hinduism. To begin with, it would really turn Hinduism into a very boring religion if we were to become a homogenized kind of thing. Yeah, but even religions of the book are not homogeneous. That's the thing, right? Like even Islam is hardly homogenized. When I wrote my book, Rebel Sultans on the Deccan Sultanates, a lot of the right wing will argue that the Muslims were like one block in India fighting the Hindus. In Rebel Sultans, you'll see that the Muslims are fighting each other as Shias and Sunnis, as Persians versus Indians. So there's ethnicity, there's sectarian differences, all of that. Exactly. Islam in Kerala took a very distinct form compared to, say, Islam in Kashmir. To the extent that in the 1940s, the Muslim League sent somebody in Kashmir to sort of canvass for support. And that person came back with a report saying that the Kashmiris don't even seem to be following real Islam. We have to go and teach them what real Islam is because their Islam is so corrupted. Same in Kerala. We have a Muslim royal family that's matrilineal. Has nothing to do with traditional, book-based definitions of Islamic family norms and all of that. But it is reality, right? So where even religions of the book are so diverse, where even a Christianity could come to Madurai and become a sacred thread-wearing, caste-recognizing phenomenon, an inherently diverse tradition like Hinduism is even tougher to sort of homogenize. So I think that push to homogenize is not very healthy, but I don't think it will work. I think there is a counter tide, right? Even the conversations we're having, even in the way people are talking about it, you do see that sometimes what happens is that those who are loud and shrill, it gives you this false impression that they dominate the scene, which is not true. It's just that they're loud and shrill. Often you'll find there is a silent majority and a very vocal minority. And we shouldn't be misled into thinking that the vocal minority has the upper ground or the upper hand, when in reality, they are vocal because they're insecure that, maybe they might lose their position. So I think there is still hope. I'm optimistic. Thank you.
On behalf of Prabha Khaitan Foundation and team, a sincere thank you to Ira Mukhoty for navigating the session so beautifully that we never want to. And of course, our star author for the evening, Manu S. Pillai. This evening, we have got some great perspectives on your book, and I'm hoping more people will pick them up to read. Our heartfelt gratitude to Dr. Shashi Tharoor for giving us great insights and outlook like never before. I would like to recognize IIC for the support as always, and the unwavering contribution and support of the Ehsaas Women of Delhi. Special thanks to Sri Cement Limited for their patronage for today's event. Last but not the least, thank you to our wonderful, engaging attendees for today. Your constant support strives us to be more and do more. Thank you and have a good night. Do feel free to pick up today's special book at a discounted rate outside and get them signed by the author right here. Thank you.
Thank you again. Thank you for having me. Thank you to the audience. As many of you I know have been waiting from 5:30. We obviously ran over, but as I said, having worked in Dr. Tharoor's office, I know that when the gods of Parliament call, you can't do anything. You are stuck in Parliament. Your phone network doesn't work, so I won't blame him for coming in a little late. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for staying. Thank you, Prabha Khaitan Foundation. And thank you, Ira, for doing this with me. Thank you.
Always a pleasure.
Thank you.